Should we get cracking? All right, the committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Opening Up the Process, Recommendations for Making Legislative Information More Transparent. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I won't use all of it. Today we're going to hear from 4 experts who will discuss current transparency efforts underway in the House, the value and challenges of making legislative information more transparent, and how sometimes too much transparency may sometimes impact the deliberative process in Congress. Providing public access to legislative data is a good idea. Ultimately, it's the people who pay for the data Congress collects. So they should be able to access basic information about what happens here, whether it's following a bill through the process, or seeing how we vote in committee and on the floor, or tracking what bills we sponsor and co-sponsor. Transparency actually promotes accountability to our constituents, and that's a good thing. Our goal with each of these hearings is to walk away with recommendations for how to make Congress work better so that it can better serve the American people. And I'm looking forward to hearing what thoughts and recommendations our witnesses and members of our committee have for making legislative information more transparent and available. And with that, I'll now invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of our witnesses here today. As we've highlighted in the past and previous hearings, this committee has a license to examine and provide recommendations on nearly everything from IT modernization to the congressional schedule to constituent communications and the legislative process itself. But the ultimate goal, as the chairman has stated, and he's so outlined for us as a mission for our committee, is to make sure that we have updates and improvements that are really here to better serve the American people. Now, all the changes we recommend, that we hope to recommend, are so that we, the members, can better serve our constituents in the long run. Now, an important part of representing our constituents is transparency. Transparency in our work and in our actions. The hearing today is important in ensuring that the People's House is transparent and open to the people. Part of improving transparency also means, though, that ensuring our constituents receive accurate and truthful information about our work on their behalf. Now, it's critical that any decision made in Congress truly benefits those we are here to represent. Now, a lot of transparency is focused on what members of Congress are up to, and that's certainly an important piece of what we're going to be talking about today. But we should also explore how transparency can truly improve how we do business and execute our responsibilities. We should also use these tools to improve the legislation that we create to address some of America's most perplexing problems and challenges that we're facing. So I want to thank, again, our witnesses for joining us today, for your insights and for what you're about to share with us. We look forward to the conversation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thanks so much. Today, we welcome the testimony of 4 witnesses. First, Robert Bob Reeves has served as Deputy Clerk for the U.S. House of Representatives since May of 2008. In addition to his deputy clerk duties, Mr. Reeves provides oversight for technical projects undertaken by the Office of the Clerk. Mr. Reeves has led initiatives to upgrade all components of the House voting systems, added Wi-Fi capabilities to the House chamber, and provided live streaming video of floor proceedings. Mr. Reeves also leads the Bulk Data Task Force, which is established by Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee in the Speaker's Office in 2012 to promote the creation of standardized bulk files of legislative data and coordinate transparency efforts across the legislative branch. Next, we have Daniel Schumann, who leads Demand Progress and Demand Progress Education Fund's efforts on issues that concern governmental transparency, accountability, and promoting an open internet. He co-founded the Congressional Data Coalition, which brings together organizations from across the political spectrum to advocate for a tech-savvy Congress. Daniel directs the Advisory Committee on Transparency, which supports the work of the Congressional Transparency Caucus. He's a nationally recognized expert on federal transparency, accountability, and capacity. Next, I'd like to welcome Joshua, is it Tauberer? Did I get it? All right, stuck the landing. He's the founder of the website govtrack.us and has been a pioneer in the field of open government. GovTrack provides free legislative reference and tracking tools to around 10 million individuals annually and has provided bulk legislative information services to dozens of House members and caucus offices. Dr. Tauberer collaborated with Demand Progress to create everycrsreport.com. He has developed technology for the House of Representatives Office of the Law Revision Council and the Council of the District of Columbia to improve the publication process of the law. And he's worked on innovating federal government cybersecurity practices through his work at GovReady PBC for the Department of Homeland Security. And then last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Frances Lee. Dr. Lee has been a member of the Maryland faculty since 2004. She teaches courses in American government, the public policy process, legislative politics, political ambition, and political institutions. Her research interests focus on American governing institutions, especially the United States Congress. Dr. Lee also serves as co-chair of the American Political Science Association's Presidential Task Force Project on Congressional Reform. She has authored several books about Congress, most recently, Insecure Majorities, Congress and the Perpetual Campaign. She received her PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University and has also worked on Capitol Hill as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And Mr. Reeves, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the accomplishments and ongoing efforts of the Office of the Clerk and the Bulk Data Task Force to make legislative data easily accessible, accurate, timely, free, reusable, and available in standardized machine-readable format. 6.5 years ago, H.R. 5882, Legislative Branch Appropriations Act of 2013, directed the establishment of the Bulk Data Task Force. The Bulk Data Task Force is a partnership of representatives from various legislative branch agencies, such as the House of Representatives, the Senate, Library of Congress, and the Government Publishing Office, that work in a cooperative manner to coordinate and accomplish openness and transparency goals. Civil society organizations also participate, including Daniel and Josh, 2 members of this panel. The Bulk Data Task Force has been fortunate to receive bipartisan support from the Committee on Appropriations Legislative Branch Subcommittee, the Committee on House Administration, and leadership offices. The late Chuck Turner from the Legislative Branch Subcommittee was an original co-chair of this group and helped to set the foundation for success. Karen Haas, our previous clerk, was a great supporter and advisor. And our new clerk, Cheryl Johnson, fully understands the importance of this work and supports our efforts. The Bulk Data Task Force started out with the goal of making legislative documents that were already available individually, available in bulk data format. Along the way, we developed the new standardized machine-readable format, United States Legislative Markup, USLM, evolved a technical relationship and open communication lines among legislative branch entities and civil society groups. We also developed a path forward for remaining House documents that are currently not in our standard data format and experienced some success with transparency projects that we have taken on. We have provided the Legislative Branch Subcommittee with progress reports every 6 months since we started. The Office of the Clerk has also played a role in fostering transparency throughout the responsibilities of the legislative process. In 2013, we developed the Bills to be Considered side of docs.house.gov, a website to provide access to legislative proposals, bills, resolutions, and amendments, at a crucial point in the legislative process that was not always available to members, staff, and the public. We also worked with CHA and committee staff to develop the committee repository, bringing together committee documents and schedules into a single location. Working with the Ethics Committee, we developed the online financial and lobbying disclosure systems and are currently working on finalizing JAC Act updates. We are currently working with the House Office of Legislative Counsel on a POSI comparative print project, and our website redesign is almost complete. We anticipate integrating a new site search capability at the end of June this year. Going forward, I see a move toward accessing data via Application Programmer Interface, APIs, instead of using bulk data files. And the clerk has positioned itself to move in that direction by developing our website using APIs. We anticipate beginning to make those APIs available both internally and to the public by the end of this year. We have already shared the committee repository API to assist the Library of Congress in their display of combined House and Senate committee schedules on congress.gov. There is also a need to look at the whole legislative drafting process, from desktop tools through the legislative drafting system, to see where we can make improvements in the process. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Next up, Mr. Schumann, you've got 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and esteemed members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Daniel Schumann, and I'm, as you mentioned, the Policy Director with Demand Progress. I should start by saying I'm honored to be joined on this panel by Deputy Clerk Reeves, by my friend Josh Tauber, and by Dr. Lee. Transparency goes to the heart of democracy and our ideas about fairness. Congressional transparency means everything from empowering each member of Congress to facilitating public participation in the political process. Just as there are many types of congressional transparency, so too are there many ways in which it can be undermined. My testimony will focus on 4 key challenges to congressional transparency. These challenges are insufficient context for deliberation, insufficient implementation of transparency rules, lapses in best transparency practices, and unequal access to information. Don't worry, this sounds grim, but this will not be a grim presentation. The best kind of transparency occurs when everyone can see all the official actions, they can consider all the relevant contextual information, they can hear all the views from the interested parties, and they can deliberate in public and, when appropriate, in private. This is the ideal. The first key challenge to transparency arises from an insufficient context for deliberation. For example, you should be able to click on a mouse and see how an amendment would change a bill. Right now, such a comparison in the context that it provides can be time-consuming to generate. Technology can fix this. Committee members should have sufficient notice of what's on the docket at a markup. They need to be able to review the draft legislation and amendments to understand what they're going to consider. Technology can fix this as well. And the public should be able to easily see when all the committees are meeting and what they're considering. We're not quite there yet, but technology can also help with this. The second key challenge to transparency arises from the insufficient implementation of transparency rules. For example, public witness information, which I filled out yesterday, contained in witness disclosure forms, should be maintained in a central database. Currently, these disclosures are filed separately and are published across many different committee websites. In addition, committee roll call votes should also be tracked in a central database alongside the text of the amendments under consideration. Currently, votes and successful amendments are published on individual committee websites in an uncoordinated fashion. The third challenge of transparency arises from lapses in best transparency practices. For example, the House Inspector General used to publish all of its reports online. Starting in the mid-2000s, the IG took down more than 100 reports and stopped publicly releasing new ones. Similarly, the rule for open committee hearings is that the press and public should be allowed to attend, like what we're seeing here today. But some committees have decided to hold open proceedings in the SCIF where the public and the press are not allowed. The fourth key challenge to transparency arises from unequal access to information. Many documents are de facto available to the public, but only if you're able to pay. For example, CRS reports have long been in this category where you had to pay a private vendor for access. While Congress has partially fixed this problem for current reports, it hasn't yet addressed it for historical reports. Similarly, you can buy Dear Colleague letters from a private vendor, but there's no official source to obtain them. And you can buy transcripts of committee proceedings, but if you want the official transcript, it's not unusual to have to wait for months. Unofficial transcripts should be published within 24 hours. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that we haven't made real progress, because we have. And in fact, Congress and this House in particular has made significant and transformative progress in bringing transparency to the institution. The most important of these efforts over the last decade have been the Bulk Data Task Force, which Deputy Clerk Bob Breves facilitates. It fosters communications and collaboration with the public and across internal congressional silos. It has been a tremendous success. Thank you. I listed its major accomplishments in my written statement because there won't be time to go through them all here. The task force should be strengthened and its role should be expanded. In addition, someone should have the job of thinking about how legislative information is made available to the public. One possible approach is the creation of a chief data officer for the legislative branch. I am encouraged by the work of the Select Committee, by your bipartisan collaboration, by your thoughtful deliberations, and I'm looking forward to our conversation on improving legislative transparency. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Tauber.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today and for your interest in transparency. My name is Joshua Tauber. I'm the founder and president of govtrack.us and a collaborator with my co-panelist Daniel on everycrsreport.com. My organization helps almost 10 million individuals each year learn about the work of the United States Congress. Our website is a free legislative tracking tool used by journalists, students, advocates, members of your staff, and members of the general public. We explain legislation, we predict the likelihood that bills will be enacted, we tweet and we send emails to users who are subscribed to email updates to track legislation. 17 years ago, when I got started in this field, transparency in Congress looked a lot different than it does today. As a student researching intellectual property legislation for a college class back in 2001, I was amazed by how much information Congress put online. But I had so many questions that the information didn't answer. For instance, who were the sponsors that were introducing the most IP legislation? And when the information was available, it wasn't always understandable. So I emailed the Library of Congress, the steward of Congress's legislative data, and asked them if they could share with me their database of legislative information, a list of bills, a spreadsheet of co-sponsors. They declined. Frustrated, I spent the next 15 years building the most detailed database of congressional information and made it freely available for anyone to reuse. To do that, I wrote software that gathered legislative information automatically so that while I was finishing my graduate degree, my software was adding more and more information to our database. I used that database to build my organization's website, govtrack.us, in 2004. Times have changed since then. In 2016, my co-panelist, Mr. Reeves, led a collaboration among legislative branch offices known as the House Bulk Data Task Force, which created an official version of the legislative database that I had created. So I deleted mine. And now GovTrack uses the official one instead. This is great for the public. But let me tell you, members of the House also appreciate that their constituents are getting better information about the legislation that they're championing on sites like GovTrack. Later in 2016, I worked with Daniel and Demand Progress to repeat a similar strategy for bringing transparency to Congressional Research Service reports. Although CRS's reports were widely available to those who could pay for them through private services, these taxpayer-funded reports, including almost 400 reports on the different ways that a bill can become a law, were not available to the public at large. So we built the most comprehensive database of CRS reports and made it available for anyone to read for free. I used the same set it and forget it strategy for every CRS report. While I'm talking to you here today, the website is gathering more reports and adding it to the website. When I build technology, my strategy is always the same. Don't do too much, but make it last forever, or at least until Congress does it better. That's how I was able to build GovTrack without any outside funding, and how we were able to build everycrsreport.com on a budget of a few tens of thousands of dollars. The first question for the Modernization Committee is whether it will make the progress of the last several years by the Bulk Data Task Force last forever, too. Making the task force permanent would ensure Mr. Reese's work will continue. But there's a bigger picture here than just creating more data. The data that Congress publishes has to be understandable. Legislative maneuvers like substitute amendments can be impediments to meaningful transparency. And there's no quick fix to this problem. It's going to require big picture thinking. The creation of a chief transparency officer for the House of Representatives or a chief data officer, as many federal agencies and localities already now have, would create a space for this big picture thinking. Lastly, I worry that the best technology work already happening in the legislative branch is not being leveraged to raise the quality of information technology throughout the House. In addition to Mr. Reeves's work, I want to highlight GPO's govinfo.gov, the Library of Congress's use of agile methodology to build congress.gov, and other projects in the House Clerk's office. Funding and elevating the technology talent that already exists in the House will pay in dividends as other parts of the legislative branch learn how to do technology and transparency better. This committee has the unique opportunity to build on the last decade's worth of progress, and I'm excited for the opportunity and look forward to discussing it more. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lee.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Frances Lee, and I'm a professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland. I'm also co-chair of the American Political Science Association's Task Force project on congressional reform. I'm here to offer a cautionary note about congressional transparency. To be candid, this is not a comfortable position to be in. Transparency is an important value, one that's essential to the democratic process. Professionally, as a political scientist, I need transparency to do research. But my goal today is to point to some of the unanticipated consequences of prior transparency reforms and to recommend that you consider how transparency can negatively affect deliberative processes. Transparency burdens deliberation in two key ways. One, it empowers organized groups to press their demands in the legislative process. And two, it tends to divert congressional discourse outward towards messaging rather than towards problem solving. Deliberation is the key concern. Congress should make information about policy outcomes as transparent as possible. When Congress enacts legislation, it should not be difficult for Americans to find out what was done or how their representatives voted. Americans should be informed about how taxpayer money is being spent and whether governmental purposes are being achieved. Any innovations in data sharing or search capabilities that make it easier for the public to access this type of information should be a high priority for congressional modernizers. But public accountability does not require that all aspects of the deliberative process be open to public view. Members need to be able to talk frankly with one another so that they can search for common ground, explore possible solutions, and build trust with one another. Congress has made the legislative process increasingly public since the transparency reforms of the 1970s. And despite their many positive consequences, these reforms have had two serious downsides for legislative deliberation. First, transparency makes it easier for organized groups, for lobbyists, to monitor and pressure Congress. This was not reformers' goal, but transparency's effect is often precisely contrary to its intended purpose. The broad public simply is not able to monitor congressional activity with the consistency or the intensity of organized interests. Sunshine reforms have proved more useful to lobbyists than to average Americans. Interest groups take advantage of the transparency to sit in on open committee meetings and markups. They then leap into action to mobilize constituencies throughout the country to tweet, email, fax, write, and call congressional offices as they seek to push or to quash proposals being considered. Ordinary citizens do not and cannot hope to match the capabilities of organized interests in these respects. A second effect of transparency is that it turns congressional deliberation outward towards messaging. Deliberating in public encourages members to direct their attention towards external constituencies and audiences rather than to engage with other members. Congressional transparency creates a version of the famous observer effect, in which observing a behavior changes the behavior being observed. Transparency encourages members to use the legislative process to score political points against their opponents in front of broader audiences. In committee and on the floor, members continually propose amendments, not in an effort to improve legislation, but instead to put their opponents on the wrong side of public opinion. Message politics has become an ever greater preoccupation for Congress since the 1994 elections and the end of the seemingly permanent Democratic majority of the 20th century Congress. As competition for majority control of Congress has intensified, an increasingly large share of floor debate and recorded votes have been aimed at communicating messages to broader constituencies. One of the unanticipated consequences of transparency has been to divert congressional negotiations to settings where the doors can still be closed. Most importantly, major legislation is now negotiated in party leadership offices, which are exempt from sunshine rules. Negotiations conducted in leadership offices do not take full advantage of the expertise that committees have. They tend to minimize the influence of rank-and-file members. But in a Congress that's been so opened up to public view, leadership offices are private venues in which it's easier to conduct negotiations. It's not likely that Congress will reverse the sunshine reforms of the 1970s. But going forward, I recommend that Congress look carefully at proposed transparency reforms to ascertain whether they have the potential to burden legislative negotiations and to work to protect the space and the privacy that they need to deliberate effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. We'll now move into the question phase. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes and start with a question for Mr. Reeves, and then if I can keep my question short and your answer short, I want to ask a question of Dr. Lee as well. So, Mr. Reeves, as you know, the Congress requires the executive departments and agencies, as well as the president and parts of the legislative and judicial branches, to produce and submit thousands of reports. And some are mandated annually, others are one-time reports, others have specific time frames, and sometimes reports are incorporated into an agency's annual report to Congress, sometimes they're not. So, in a nutshell, Congress gets a lot of reports every year, but finding this information, finding out about information about these reports, much less obtaining them, is often very, very difficult. So I wanted to get a sense from you, what would it take for the House Clerk's office to actually publish all of the reports that are due to Congress on one central and public site?
Thank you, Chair Kilmer. My understanding is that there is currently a bill that was introduced, H.R. 736, to access congressionally mandated reports. The current process is that these reports go to the Speaker's office, and then the Speaker refers them to the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians make a referral to which committee it's going to go to, but send it to us. We make a note of the report, put it in our LIMS system, Legislative Information Management System, and then we give it to the committee. So there are a lot of unknowns. We don't know what bill it ties to. We don't know, for instance, would the requirement for such a website be that we just do a scanned PDF? Would we want to receive those documents in an electronic format so that they could be more easily searched? So I think there's a lot of questions that we would want to iron out in just getting to what the requirement of what we need is. Is it possible? Yes. It's just a matter of exactly what it is we're trying to do.
I'd love to, and I think some other members of the committee, I think we'd love to circle back with you and get a better sense of, like, specifically what it would take to do that. Okay. I think that comes up a fair amount, where I know we ask for reports and then there's this sense that they go into the ether somewhere. Dr. Lee, so you've written a lot about dysfunction and polarization in the Congress, and I want to get your sense of, how do you counter those trends, given that we have very narrow margins between the parties? There's a lot more, this place is very political, and I want to get your counsel on any sense of how to get out of that trap.
Well, one thing I would say on behalf of congressional performance is that legislation, even today, is still bipartisan. It's still bipartisan to the same extent as legislation in the 1970s, in the 1980s. In fact, there's been no trend towards more legislation passing on narrow party lines. So negotiation and bipartisanship still happens in the legislative branch today. This doesn't make the front pages, typically. The news focus on conflict. But Congress performs better than It appears to from watching news coverage of Congress. Now, those negotiations, those bipartisan negotiations that have to happen for legislation to occur are mostly not happening in public. I am struck by the fact that in the legislative branch, there aren't formal, regularized meetings where parties can meet on a bipartisan basis, that the regular formal closed-door meetings that occur in Congress are the ones that occur in the party caucuses and the party lunches every week. But there isn't a setting like that where the parties can come together behind closed doors. I think that would be helpful, but clearly Congress is still doing that because that legislation is still happening and it is bipartisan by and large.
What form would you have that take?
Well, I would leave it up to Congress to find a form that would be useful to you. I mean, there have been frequently, over the years, proposals to have bipartisan retreats. They are sort of one-off affairs. It needs to be meaningful to members. I would encourage creative thinking there. I don't think it's something that can be prescribed from the outside. But it is striking that the closed-door meetings that still occur in a regular way are along straight party lines.
Yeah. I think the only exception is when we have a classified briefing. And I'm always struck when I walk out of those that they seem to actually be very civil, sane, and constructive. That's not always the case when the cameras are on, unfortunately. So. Okay, with that, Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and might I add, cameras are on today, and this is probably one of the most civil committees there are in the House of Representatives. I appreciate each of your testimonies, and it's fascinating and fantastic to hear your thoughts, and Dr. Lee, your perspectives are unique but well received by this committee and other members too. We've heard similar thoughts and concerns about how the institution operates because of potential theater that might occur, and maybe it's not intentional. It's just nature that and instincts that take over in a political environment. Mr. Schumann, if I could just ask you maybe to dig a little deeper in some of your ideas. Those are really neat ideas, and you make them sound very simple, and I imagine they are simple because you say technology can fix this, and you mentioned one as it relates to amendments and how it interacts and just say we're in a process and that you should be able to click on an amendment in an electronic format and see how it fits into a piece of legislation and potentially have the impact. In addition to that, I assume you were referencing that when a bill is being proposed, that being able to see how that proposed language fits in to existing language, what's being eliminated and what's being added. We don't have that benefit today, and I think you're touching on that. Maybe you could just dig a little deeper into that, and then, Mr. Reeves, if you could help us understand what are the barriers to that kind of simple technology or ability to see this kind of interface or interaction of policy mashing together. What prevents that from happening? What direction do you need, or does an office need to implement, and where does that come from? Does it mean laws have to change, or is it direction from leadership and such? We're trying to learn how to implement unique ideas into the process. Mr. Schumann, if you want to dig in a little deeper than Mr. Reeves, and how would we implement such a thing?
So I have good news for you, which is that the House is currently trying to build exactly this system, where you can see how an amendment would change a bill and how the bill would change the law in real time. There's a number of complexities that arise in how legislation is drafted. You have to go and look at, if this bill says go to this other bill and strike line 27 and insert the following, a machine needs to be able to understand that, and that is complex to do. That there are issues that arise with the way the U.S. Code is. Some of it is law, some of it's not law. You have to look at it gets weedy pretty quick, but the good news is that this is something that the Clerk's Office and others, the Office of Law Revision Counsel, have already been working on. And I'd love to go more into it, but I think Mr. Reeves might be able to speak to it better than I can.
I think the project we're talking about is the POSI comparative print.
Yeah, it's POSI, but it's also the Amendment Impact Program.
Amendment.
Yeah.
So as Daniel says, we are currently working on this. We're working on Phase 2, which we started last August. Phase 2 will be complete in August of this year, and then Phase 3 would be complete August of 2020. The intent at the end is to provide a tool that would allow members, staff, to do document comparisons, amendment to document comparisons by executing this tool, and have confidence that the tool is giving them a good representation of what the changes would be. As Daniel said, one of the things that we're working on now is the building the engine that's going to interpret the instructions to compare the bills. So it needs to be, and my understanding from talking to our folks is right now we're in the 90% range that we believe that we have confidence in the tool, but it needs to be higher. And so we're looking to continue to move to make this tool available. Today it is available, but it's available only to the Office of Ledge Counsel and I believe the Rules Committee. And so they have the ability to do some of these comparisons and provide responses back, but it requires an attorney to sit there to make decisions that we're trying to automate. And so it takes time, and it becomes a bottleneck within the Office of Ledge Counsel if there's too many requests to do it, and there's just not enough time for them to do it in a timely manner.
So it's in process, still a little ways away, what the proposals you're working on. How difficult is it for members to receive, let's say somebody introduces a piece of legislation and it says strike subsection 10A. Why don't we see what that language is that's stricken? All we see is the word strike section 10A. Is that difficult to do? And how do we implement that? Or is that what you're, and I'm talking about not in digital format now, I'm just talking about on paper, old technology.
Well, my understanding of the way the tool is going to work is that you'll be able to see the old and the new side by side. So you're going to be able to see what there was and what the action was and what the new bill is going to look like.
And that's not available today in paper format? You're working on it in digital format, is that correct?
Well, we're working on it in digital format, but it can be printed. And again, to a degree, some of that is available today through the Office of Legislative Counsel.
Okay. Thank you each. So this has been great, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pocan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. So let me ask my question. My main question is around lobbying and disclosure of lobbying, because I think people really want to know who's lobbying on what. I just learned yesterday that there's almost 1,500 lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry in Washington. So that means 3 per every member. I'm not sure who my 3 are. But it's something that in Wisconsin, we have a great website, lobbying.wi.gov, which is put up by the Ethics Commission. I can easily go there right now and see who every lobbyist is, who they work for, what any given company is lobbying on right now. And I tried that on the federal site. And because there's a House site and a Senate site and a DOJ site, there's not like one location to find all of this information. And to be perfectly honest, I looked at it, I can't figure out what I'm trying to find out. It's not, I like the user-friendly, what you see is what you get, plug and play, all the different terminology that you all use. I want to make it something that average person can look up something and see who's really behind something, because often a bill has a really nice name to it, but the bill doesn't have much to do with the name that's assigned to it. Is there a way that we could like streamline even the information, the disclosures and the presentation on the lobbying side so that people could really have a very clean and transparent view of what's going on?
So yes, so I mean, what you're saying makes perfect sense. Some of this has to do with the way the different lobbying systems are constructed, where we have different registration for domestic lobbyists, which is under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which is what the Clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate have. Whereas if you're a foreign lobbyist, you have to register, it's under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is more popular than it used to be, apparently. And these are sort of different data sets. And part of what you need to be able to do both with that and when you're looking at like SEC data or Federal Elections Campaign is that So I'm a federally registered lobbyist, so I register under the LDA because I don't work for any foreign governments. So I fill out my information in one place. I'm Daniel Schumann. I'm registered under Demand Progress. Well, I lobbied for Sunlight Foundation. But Sunlight Foundation might have listed me as Dan Schumann, or maybe they fat-fingered and they wrote Daniel Schulman because they didn't spell it right or something. So it's hard to know, one, that I'm the same person sort of throughout this process, and that you can look at all the different places that I've lobbied. And then if let's say I work for a corporation, so if Demand Progress is Demand Progress, Inc., if we're registered with the FEC or with the SEC, there should be a unique identifier there as well. So what you can do is you can take these different data sets and you can sort of meld them together. And this is what Open Secrets does, the Center for Responsive Politics. They spend tons and tons and tons of time trying to take all these different information, sometimes that's incomplete or badly filed, and try to make it make some kind of sense. But it doesn't. Part of it is there's certain information that is being reported but not being fully disclosed. So I have a unique ID inside the House and inside the Senate. Current practice is that unique ID is not disclosed to the public, so you can't see that I'm the same person who was lobbying for the Sunlight Foundation 10 years ago. There's the witness disclosure forms that I had to fill out yesterday to testify. It's a PDF document that goes on the committee website somewhere. It's not connected to this other data set. So you need to have the data sort of underlying all of this stuff. You need to have it exposed to the public so that someone or an entity can come and sort of connect it all together. I don't know if there's more that you want to say.
Well, what I'd like to add is that it is on the clerk's list to revisit the lobby disclosure system that we support. We do the back-end technical work for it, and then the front end is kind of split, as you say, between the House and the Senate. It's something that we need to work together with our Senate counterparts in the Secretary's office to come up with what it is we would want in a new design. Unique IDs is something that, on the House side, that we certainly favor, to be able to track someone, whether they move from the House to the Senate or wherever they go. So it's certainly something that we're open to consider. It's not something we're currently working on. Currently, we're working on the recently passed JACT Act legislation to make sure that gets implemented, I believe, by the end of this month. So.
I would recommend, take a look at the Wisconsin site, and if you have feedback specifically on that, it's just so easy. I just went to it and I looked up a company and saw they're not working on something that was that easy. Went to the federal site and I have no idea how to use it. And I'm sure there's people who are paid to know, but that's probably the same people who are paid to be lobbyists who know who's doing what. And I'd like to see if there's a way we can make that more transparent. So. And since I have a yellow light, not yet red, real quick, any other governmental bodies we should be looking at that have best practices in this area?
18F, USDF, the 18F and the U.S. Digital Service would probably have best practices on the publication of information as data that might be helpful, particularly around what you're describing, which is user-centered design, which is designing it so that you can actually use it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I'm thinking, Dr. Tarver, of a time when I was looking for a district map back in the early part of the 2000s. I couldn't find one from any government source, so as sitting in a congressional office, I had to go to govtrack.us to find a district map to check on some lines. Fascinating. What non-government dollars do when there's a need, and folks commit themselves to filling that need. And I'm grateful to you for demonstrating that in real life. Philosophically, I sit closer to Dr. Lee, having served up here as a staffer and served as a member. I still notice when you walk back towards the House chamber, it says no pictures beyond this point, because we've decided that when you cross that threshold, deliberation is more important than transparency. So thinking particularly about you, Dr. Tarver, and you, Mr. Schumann, having dedicated yourselves to transparency, what say you if my goal is productivity instead of transparency, what still more is there to do in the realm of transparency to achieve better productivity?
Sure. So thank you, Congressman, for your comments about GovTrack before. I would say, by and large, for GovTrack, we don't look at private deliberative information at all. We don't do any work that tries to expose private information, all the information that's on GovTrack is public through some other means, and we just do it better in many cases. And we have data analysis to reveal a clearer picture of what's going on based on already public information. And in the case of CRS reports, it was, it was widely available to many thousands of people who were already paying for it. So I think, I'm not sure I want to get into deliberative information because that's not what I do.
Okay. Okay.
So, sort of a couple of thoughts. One is transparency isn't just transparency to the public, it's also transparency to the members or to the committee. So when you're going to go to a committee and vote, you should have the bill in enough time, or the amendment, or the manager's amendment, or whatever it is that you actually know what you're going to vote on. So this isn't necessarily public transparency, but this is transparency to the members. It's that the rules are what you would expect them to be. So that the rules are debated, that you have an opportunity to have input, that you know that you'll have 5 minutes, or what it, like, so that is also an aspect of transparency. And I think where I might disagree with Dr. Lee, maybe a little bit, although maybe not, which is that as things stand now, for a lot of these deliberative spaces, there is still public access to that information, but that public access varies based on how well connected you are, how well heeled you are. So if I want to get a copy of an amendment that's going to be voted on in committee tomorrow, I probably can't get it. But if I am a giant company that hires a staffer who used to work for the committee, who is now my chief lobbyist, and I say, hey, can you do me a solid and get me a copy of that amendment, they're going to see it. So some of the issue here is not about transparency, yay or nay. It's about managing the consequences that some people have access to things in advance and some people don't.
Well, we won't be able to explore it all here, but CRS is a good example. We're talking about whether we need to staff up CRS, whether they have a larger role to play in the 21st century as congressional staffs remain small. But I don't want the public to have access to what Nick Skafaris on my staff briefs me on before this committee hearing. Well, this one would be okay, Mr. Chairman, but some others I might not want that. But if I'm going to rely more on CRS, I'm going to need more of a attorney-client privilege with CRS to have that, and they offer us that in their non-public reports, and I don't want to undermine public confidence. I want to raise public confidence. I just happen to believe in 2019, I raised public confidence less by working on transparency and more by working on productivity, that it's folks that are discouraged by our output.
Can I talk to that example specifically?
Please.
Since I used to work at CRS in the American Law Division providing bad legal advice to members of Congress. And we have never advocated for, nor would we support, access to the confidential memos or the advice that CRS gives you. That is wholly inappropriate. That is totally within the realm of the members. They should be the ones to decide. But if there are reports, and there are the thousands of CRS reports that are general distribution reports that are available on their website that you can call the member's office and get, that private services were selling. So so like the advice that your staffer gives you before you come over here about what questions to ask, I should never see that. I don't want your papers. Like that is not appropriate. But once you engage in an official act or something that provides very useful context for what's going on, then you need to weigh whether the value of having public being able to ask an intelligent question or understand what you're doing, and you have to weigh that against the nature of the communication. In those circumstances, the balance may come out different ways depending on what we're talking about.
I thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want us to function at a much higher level than we're doing, as I think it's doing enormous damage. I got up this morning, we had a horrible beginning of the day to see the Boston Red Sox at the White House. Only the white players are there. None of the African American nor Latino or Caribbean players attended, and I'm watching that and thinking we are exporting that as a body, and so I want to fix it. But I'm very curious on kind of following up what you were just saying, but I'm kind of curious about some of the progress we made as a nation. I'm not sure that Lyndon Johnson would have been able to get the Civil Rights Bill or the Voting Rights Act approved if the world was involved in hearing and viewing his interactions and the deal making that took place to get that done. And in the Capitol, there's a room on the first floor where Harry Truman and his posse were playing cards and drinking bourbon when the Secret Service came over to inform him that President Roosevelt had died. I don't drink and I don't smoke. I mean, I'm a vegetarian. But as mayor of Kansas City, we have a sunshine law, so members of the city council had to be careful about going out to lunch together because there's 4 members of the council went out to lunch. I mean, they're in violation of the sunshine law. We managed to work and get a lot of things done. So I'm not saying I oppose having sunshine. I am saying that it is a much more complicated issue than just making a declaration. And I'm willing to do almost anything to change the trajectory of this national hostility. So how do you? I mean, how do you handle the fact that in spite of some times when we had hardly any transparency, we got some of the biggest things in our history done? Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So, sort of 2 related thoughts, 3 related thoughts, and I'll be very brief because I know that one is that that was a very different era, and Lyndon Johnson also used to hand out bags of money on the floor. I mean, there are things that were done at that time which aren't done now. But to the better point, I think about having safe spaces. I think they used to exist and they were taken away. There used to be congressional member organizations where staff would support members to come together around various issues, where they would meet in private in a bipartisan basis and have conversations around issues. That was defunded in 1995. So if you wanted to meet on agricultural or human rights or whatever issue you would want to meet and have staff who can support and help you in that space, that is something that no longer exists. And that has taken away from the nature and the quality of the conversations that members can have with each other privately. And that would be something that I would strongly encourage supporting, bringing it back. And just very finally, the other thing that's changed is the funding for Ledge Branch is entirely different from what it was before, and that has changed the nature of the dynamic here as well. So, sorry.
You want to?
Yeah, if I could add also, I think that we would probably all agree here that given the current information environment that we have to deal with, that it is better for everyone if everybody is more educated. If we educate the public better on how things actually work, what is a reasonable expectation, what policy goals are possible, and for you all to have better information as well about what's happening within the Capitol by your colleagues. And so I think we're not doing this for the sake of transparency. I think we actually believe that there will be better outcomes and Congress will work better in an environment where there's better transparency. I totally acknowledge the concerns that you have, but better outcomes also can come from transparency in other ways.
On this point, I would say that it's important to keep in mind that there are tough trade-offs involved with transparency. We don't expect presidents to conduct foreign affairs in public. We understand that these kinds of conversations need to be frank and that they cannot occur in public settings. It's likewise true for domestic policymaking as well as for foreign policy, that in domestic policymaking, when you're trying to work out legislation with other members, that they come in package deals. And so you're not necessarily enthusiastic about every aspect of a piece of legislation that you have worked out with others across the aisle. If that then is presented in open committee, where then there's an opportunity to then pick apart the package deal, so that think in terms of a program that members support would like to institute. The pay-fors or the offsets required to fund that program typically somewhat painful and not something you necessarily would want to support in isolation from the rest of the program. It only stands or falls as part of the larger deal. And so when deliberation happens in public view and members are put on the spot, do you support this aspect of the bill? Well, maybe you don't, but you support the whole approach to addressing the problem. And so it's somewhat misleading, I think, to put members in public on every aspect of a piece of legislation, when as a whole package you might support it, even if not everything is what you'd prefer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks all of you for being here and adding to this. I think this is if we could solve the issues surrounding this topic, we'd be in a lot better place in Congress. I like the direction of the conversation. I got to associate myself with Mr. Pocan's comments. I think the state of Washington, too, does a lot better job of keeping members informed of changes that are being proposed. We have, I think they're called red line versions of bills, where it's very clear what's being changed, what would be added or subtracted by amendments. And I think we are also much more transparent as far as the lobbying community is concerned as well. So there's got to be examples out there. It may be a voluminous issue here in D.C. There's just more information to deal with, but I think there's examples that could be helpful. I've said before in this committee, and half jokingly but half serious too, that things would be a lot better if we just got rid of the TV cameras. And we can never do that, I don't think, because there's a big, transparency is certainly important, and I would advocate that we need to improve transparency. But also, I gotta say that I liked what you said, Dr. Lee, transfers deliberation to messaging, and we see that every single day. Both sides are guilty of that, and to me, that doesn't add to the quality of our productivity. So some of the ideas that have been presented this morning talk about increasing the availability of safe places for members of Congress to be able to deliberate. So I'd like to explore that some more. How could we possibly, I'm sorry, I'm getting, but how can we improve that ability but also keeping a strong level of transparency as well? Could you just expound on that? You talked a little bit about what we used to have. Are there ideas that we maybe could look at as a modernization committee, what we could return to or include again? Yeah, Mr. Schumann, sorry.
So we had suggested to be included in the 116th rules package was the idea of each member of Congress be given the equivalent of $10,000 that they could put towards a congressional member organization. If every member were to give this, that'd be $4.41 million, which is nothing, but compare a ledge branch overall, it's not a lot of money. And they'd be able to take that money and put it towards these member organizations to pay for staff. So if you wanted to be a member of the Environmental Caucus, you could put your $10,000 towards that. And if 8 members get there, you've got $80,000. You have enough to pay for a person. What you do is you're creating a place where you can have a conversation, where you can have someone who is supporting you, who is focused on the issues that you care about. This is bipartisan, so that anybody can be a participant in it. And this is not the same, but it's similar to what we had before. There was the Democratic Study Group, which was this tremendous driver of conversation among Democrats and Republicans that provide expert advice on what was happening in the legislative process. So there are ways, and you release a charter for the group if they do public things, like they have a House website or something like that. So it's not entirely internal, like they can put on events, they can get rooms. But that way you have a safe space for conversation. You have people that are supporting members that care about an issue or a set of issues. But at the same time, if you want to go and have a private conversation with like-minded members where you can work together and strategize, you can do that.
Do you think that would minimize the messaging that used to be deliberation?
So I think that's driven by things that are outside of Congress. I think the nature of the world has changed where messaging is just sort of inescapable. But I think what it does is it makes it possible to find allies.
To find
allies, to find
allies.
members who agree with you that you would never find before. And a lot of the recommendations that we've made elsewhere around the data, it's this member introduced this bill 2 years ago that you would never have found no matter how much you researched on exactly the topic that you care about. Or they sent this dear colleague. It's being able to find the unlikely allies that care about what you care about, which is what makes this institution work. This is the role that lobbyists play now, and that's the danger, right? Like, you should not be coming to me for expertise to say, well, these are the 8 other members that care about this issue. You should be able to figure that out and find that yourself.
Institutionally should be available.
Exactly right.
Yep. Well, again, thank you all for being here, and this truly is a huge part of what we're trying to modernize in Congress, and I appreciate your input here this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Delbene.
We'll go from Washington State to Washington State. So thank you all for being here. We had a hearing just recently where we heard from former members of Congress, and I think all of them said in one way or the other how important it was that Congress isn't afraid of using new technology, that we have to be thoughtful about how we do that, but doing nothing also has had a lot of detriment. And so, Mr. Reeves, in your testimony, you explain that the conversation around information transparency has evolved, and the question evolved from, will we have publicly available documents, to how can we modernize our systems and workflows to utilize newer technologies to help our constituents and staff access information. So based on your experience, what's the low-hanging fruit? What are the things that we should be doing right away to incorporate newer technologies in Congress that really will have an immediate benefit?
Well, I mean, I think that, you mean from a legislative perspective, or?
Well, it doesn't have to be legislative, or what aren't we doing that we should be doing? Whether it's legislative or whether it's more administrative, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think there's a couple things. Better communication. One of the things that even within the bulk data task force that we really don't get exposure to is communication actually with the public. So we do talk to the civil society groups, and we kind of take it from their view that they're getting that perspective from the public, but we don't get it directly from the public. We do have public meetings, usually 2-3 times a year. We have started making the invitations more public using GitHub, but a lot of the people that attend are same people that have attended it, either people in the civil society group or academics that have participated in the group as well. So I think one is communication. How do we get more of what the public wants? How do we get more exposure to more of what the public wants? A second thing would be, and I think Josh mentioned this, or maybe it was Daniel, education. So the legislative process, as you know, is not easy to understand. And so we get a lot of questions because there isn't an understanding of how to best look for the data. What are you looking for? Where should you look for it? So I think another piece would be, how do we better educate folks on where they can find things that they're looking for and make it easier for them to get it? You know, one of the theories that we've been using since the bulk data task force started was we didn't want to make data redundant. So if the Library of Congress has bill summary information and they're the owner of it, we didn't want to copy that data and put it on the clerk's website. So instead, we made a decision that if people are going to look for bill summary data, we're going to link to them from the clerk's website to the Library of Congress to make that available. Is that the way that we want to do it? Does the public want to do it that way? I mean, technically, that's the better way to do it, but it may not always be the easiest from the public's view.
Do we, I worked in technology before I ended up in this role, and we would do testing, right? We would get groups of people together and we'd watch them trying to find information and see whether they were able to find what they were looking for or not, and learn from their experiences to make it better. Do we do things like that?
We do. So, the clerk is right now, we have two websites, clerk.house.gov, our older website, and then we have another one called clerkpreview.house.gov, which is now in a beta format. So probably around June of this year, we're going to get rid of our old site and keep our new one. But on our new website, we have a survey. So the survey says, do you like the way we've produced the data? What would you change? How would you what else would you like to see? We ask those questions. I can't tell you that we get a lot of responses.
But
I
guess as members of Congress, are we aware of what's happening there, and can we help ask our constituents to weigh in and give their feedback on these things? Because clearly, if we're communicating to constituents and they're looking for information, maybe that's a way to help connect them and get that feedback back in.
I think that's a great idea. We would be very welcome to any direction you can provide to have your constituents look at things that we do and give us feedback. I mean, we'd be open to that, certainly.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
It's funny, the transparency in the legislative process. Last night I was giving a tour of the Capitol, and you go in the old Senate chamber, and there's the original bill hopper. And transparency at that time was that as a bill moved through the process, it just went up a shelf. And the shelves narrow as you go up because it's really hard to pass legislation. So that was transparency 19th century style. Mr. Timmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for coming to speak with us today. I agree that there should be more transparency when it comes to legislative information. But before that can happen externally, it needs to happen internally. I have joked with issue advocates that they will know what hearings my committees will hold weeks before I will. Even as a member, there's no real transparency about committee activity if you're a part of the minority. To be clear, I'm not blaming the current majority because I'm confident that both parties operate in the same fashion. And I must point out that I'm not referencing this committee because our leadership has been incredibly inclusive and I've really enjoyed being a part of it. So my question is, how can we expect to have public transparency when members of committees are kept in the dark? How do you suggest we change the culture, or should we begin by strengthening internal transparency rules as a precursor to strengthening external transparency?
So I think you do both, because it is a real problem. Members don't have enough notice about what's going on. They don't have enough. I mean, how many times do you have to go to 3 committees at the same time, right? Like the planning process alone doesn't make any sense. Like there isn't a, you could be in and have to be in Longworth, Rayburn, and Cannon all at the same time, and it's not possible for anyone. There are opportunities to do this. So the House rules, or you could do a resolution that would affect it. Committees adopt the rules at the beginning of each Congress, and you could say, hey, it shouldn't be 3 days notice, it should be 4 days notice, it should be 5 days notice for when the hearing is going to be. Hearings, I think under House rules, are 7 days notice and markups are 3 days. And it's days, which means that it can be the functional equivalent of 24 hours in a couple minutes. One of the changes that the Democrats made when they took control this time around was they expanded the Republican 3-day rule to make it 72 hours before legislation can be considered on the floor. There may be value in doing something similar to that. Putting out tentative dates for when hearings are going to take place is something that is helpful. So we don't know that we're going to use this time, but we expect that we'll be meeting during this time. The prior, when you had the former members, they were talking about 5 days on for 2 weeks. You could look at Monday, Wednesday, Friday are 4 vote days, and Tuesdays and Thursdays are committee hearing days. Like you can move your calendar, the chamber calendar around, so that you have greater expectation about when things are going to happen. And a lot of the technology that we've been talking about, and Mr. Reeves has been talking about showing how an amendment changes a bill and a bill changes a law. When you get that manager's amendment 24 hours in advance, and it's like, go to this thing and strike this, and you have no idea what it says. If we can fix some of the technological side of that, you'll actually have a chance to know what it does. And while that doesn't give you more time, that gives you more information, which is almost as valuable. So those might be some ways that you can address that. So for the committees on which you sit, you could suggest an amendment to the committee rules. A resolution in the chamber would work. And if you've got a good chair like Chairman Kilmer, you say, hey, if you're planning things out for the next month, can you share with us what's looking on a tentative basis? At least for the better run committees, they may be more willing to do something like that. And the final thing I would suggest is that when you get into the majority, and you will get into the majority at some point because it always flips back and forth, it's important to remember how awful it is to be in the minority and to take some of those practices and bring them the next time that you're in power. Because people forget that pretty quickly, and it is something that is essential to make the institution work.
I always joke that there's 12 people in my primary that would love to be in the minority. But
Yeah.
If I could,
their thoughts?
yeah, if I could add to that, there's a maxim in the private sector, which is you can't fix what you don't measure. The first way that you can begin to look at what are these policy impediments to transparency would be to pick a few and start measuring it. How often are bills, or how many days in advance, on average, are bills made available before you have to have a hearing, right? There are a lot of ways to collect data on these sorts of issues. Daniel has proposed several of these over many years, sometimes about how staff pay and so on. So I would recommend starting with a few and having the committee start to take the lead on measuring what the current state is of some of these issues.
One last thing. So we've had 3 hearings thus far, and it seems some of the big topics are calendar, what days we meet, and schedule, what we do with those days. So I think technology is going to play an important role in that to try to decrease the amount of multiple obligations at the same time. So maybe we can work together in the future about potential technological solutions to those problems as well. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all so very much for being here. I'm going to build on a few questions that my colleagues have asked, but I have to tell you, I came to Congress in 2013 as an attorney. I was incredibly frustrated that we didn't have the comparative on amendments on bills, and so I'm thrilled about the COSI comparative print project, but let me ask you, Mr. Reeves, is there anything we could do to speed it up? Are there resources you need? Is there anything we could do? I understand you're under contract. You've got a vendor, a contractor working on it and so forth. But is there any additional resources clerk's office might need to speed it up?
I don't believe so at this time. Some things I think, like one of the things that we're doing right now is building this artificial intelligence engine. And that's to interpret the different, like strike or, insert, and then be able to compare that to the previous legislation to find out where it needs to go and all that type of thing. So being able to put more people to do one thing, I don't think in this case is going to make it go any faster in the case of building this engine. I'm not sure of, the goal is to complete this engine in the second phase. I'm not sure if when we get to the third phase, there may be other opportunities once we know that that works to be able to accelerate some of the other things that we're trying to do, which some of them are, for instance, the interface to the user and things like that. There's potentially the opportunity to accelerate those things with more resources at that time.
Please let us know. I do have a question because I was working on a piece of legislation with the Senate, the Pandemic All Hazard Preparedness Act, which we got through the House, had a Senate Ledge Council, according to my staff, would routinely provide the Senate committee staff with the comparative print on the Senate side. So how is it that the Senate's doing it and we're not doing it? They're the body that's usually behind us on this. But so were you aware of that? That the Senate has the tool? Or are any of you aware of that?
So, I think they're doing it by hand.
Pardon?
They're not, they don't have a mechanism, they're doing it by hand. They have, the volume of members that they have to deal with in legislation is different. And Josh probably has the statistics on it. So yeah, and so right now, like if you have a bill that's reported out of committee, at the end of the committee report, you have a comparative print because someone goes and does that by hand. So I suspect that they're doing it that way, not
So the Word document that my staff would receive showing the comparisons was all done by hand?
Some poor person.
Okay,
was probably
okay.
doing
Well,
that.
thank you. Thank you for that. Another question. I want to build on the low-hanging fruit question, Dr. Tauber. Did you have any ideas, since you have, created the databases in the past, is there any low-hanging fruit right now we should be focusing on? And is there any particular data sets that you need that you don't have?
Thank you for the question. Yes, there's always low-hanging fruit. There's always more data to work on. So amendments are one of the missing pieces, I think, right now. As you know, on high-profile legislation, amendments are where the real action is. And there's comparatively little information available on the text of amendments, especially before they're voted on, that we have access to.
What would that take for you to get those amendments in the manner in which you would like them? And in the format in which you would like them?
Right. So getting them into a structured data format where the text is electronic, easy to copy and search and sort, it may not be easy, and it's not. I'm not sure. So I know that sort of on the worst end of this, I know members can just scribble amendments on the floor and hand them in, and this would be relatively hard to digitize.
Right.
And so there's an end of this that would be hard, but that shouldn't stop us from making progress where we can.
And very quick question to any of you. Are you aware of, we're in the middle of the week of the Congressional App Challenge, and we had all of these brilliant young people from all of our districts submit apps. I didn't have time to go around and visit all of those booths or all of the winners from each of our districts. Are any of you familiar with any apps that have already been created or are in process of being created that you think would be spectacular and that would be used? Are you familiar with any of them, or do you even follow any of what all of these young people are creating? Mr. Schumann, any of you?
Oh, yeah, so I've been every year. I go to the Congressional App Challenge. They do a phenomenal job. It's been doubling it's been doubling every year. The kids are amazing.
Yes, they are.
I was talking to a sixth grader who was coding in Ruby on Rails and had built something. I mean, they're phenomenal. I'm an attorney by trade, so I'm lucky if I can get my basic sums right. And they just blow me away how phenomenal they are.
Well, thank you for paying attention. Wanted to give a shout out to the Congressional App Challenge because they may be we might be needing to talk to some 6th graders and 12th graders about how to help us with this, and I'm kind of serious. So anyway, I yield back.
Yeah. Maybe the app challenge should be only focused on things that will make Congress work better. Yeah. Next year's app challenge.
Great.
We have the technology. So we have a little bit of time before votes are called, and I think there are some members of the committee who have other questions. I have one. I just want to reflect what I think we heard today and see if there's nodding heads from everyone on the panel or shaking heads if you think it's a bad idea. So I think I've heard at least a couple of you say, let's have a chief data officer or chief transparency officer as a position that helps drive some of this transparency effort. Is there generally agreement that's something we've heard and that's a good idea? Mr. Reeves is going, And, okay, do you want to express any specific concerns on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in favor of it or opposed to it. One of the things, actually, I've talked to Daniel a little bit about it. He mentioned it to me. Probably in 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to hold another Bulk Data Task Force public meeting, and what I'd like to do is put that on the agenda as a discussion item, because what I'd like to get at is what is it that we're not doing that they think that a chief data officer is going to solve. Mm-hmm. And so if we can have that discussion, then I'd be able to give you a better answer as to, yeah, I think it's a good idea, or no, I think we can do this and not have to do that.
Rebuttal?
I think the proposal is not should not be taken to say that the work of the Bulk Data Task Force has not achieved exactly what we had hoped, and instead that there was more to do, and perhaps that there are other stakeholders not focused specifically on legislative data that we also want to get into the room and make more progress on.
Go ahead.
If I can add to that, like, I think the Bulk Data Task Force has been a tremendous success and should be expanded to be the Congressional Data Task Force. I think that a Chief Transparency Officer can help support its work. The problem is not the House. The House is doing a good job. The people in the House are doing a great job with the resources that are available. I think they should have more resources than they do to do what they're doing. But there is a coordination problem across the legislative branch. GPO and the library and CBO and all of these other entities are all in different places. And you need to have it in Josh's whispering mayor and the Senate. So having someone who can help facilitate, who can help support them collaborating better together. I mean, this is the idea as a legislative branch chief data officer, not just someone for the House.
And I mean, one of the other concerns with that type of position is as you know, we don't have one place in the legislative branch that everyone answers to. So it's okay. One of the questions I would have for them is, well, who does it report to? I mean, is it in the clerk's office? Well, then is the Senate going to listen to what they have to say? So those are the types of questions that I'd like to have a discussion to kind of figure out, okay, we kind of think we have maybe an idea, and then maybe we can bring that idea to you and say, you know, we've talked about it, and here's what we think is a workable solution.
Great. I think you've got members of this committee who'd love to be part of that conversation. We've heard some other stuff, but I want to make sure to give other folks time for, I think there seems to be a theme around wanting to support and make sure that there's adequate capacity to be able to do some of the stuff that you're working on. You know, the bill tracking and amendment marking and all of those sorts of things seem really important and seem underway, and from a capacity standpoint, making sure that you can execute quickly, deliver on that so that we can open up some of this process. I think I've heard that. I think a couple folks mentioned the lobbying disclosure piece, supporting the POSI project implementation, and then Dr. Lee's point about trying to think about ways to enable members to deliberate in across party lines, I think are takeaways that I heard from this. And I want to turn to Vice Chair Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few follow-ups. And Dr. Lee, I sort of associate myself with my fellow Georgian here about your viewpoints and perspective. I have a great appreciation for what you've shared with us. And reading your testimony, you outline a lot of the challenges and maybe unintentional consequences that have occurred, unintended consequences that have occurred. Any recommendations you would have for the committee to look forward? I know you say as you evaluate additional transparency, consider these concerns, but are there recommendations you would have for us based on some of the concerns you've outlined?
Well, I didn't know coming in today what the recommendations for additional transparency would be proposed. But as I have listened to the testimony, I would just ask that you scrutinize it carefully, that any proposals that you adopt don't have the potential to burden deliberation. In listening to recommendations to create a chief data officer or transparency officer, what I hear in that is also to create a position in the House of Representatives that will advocate for more transparency. And so you want to know whether that's putting a thumb on the scale of opening up processes that work better behind closed doors. Now, I think there are obviously great needs for coordination. That's true for Congress across the board, especially a bicameral Congress. But so there's certainly a rationale there, but there are always trade-offs with all of these institutional reforms, and so some sensitivity to the ways in which those reforms can have these downsides.
As it relates to previous reforms that you've identified have created some concerns or unintended consequences, can you address any of those? I know you're talking about new reforms we might be considering, but past reforms that you feel like have caused some unintended consequences.
Going back to the 70s and opening up committees that who attends. And so it goes to it goes to Mr. Reeves' point that, who's paying attention to congressional transparency? You try to reach out to a broad public, but the people who show up are the people who have a stake in the outcome. And so as we open up committees, what that opens Congress up to is more pressure from organized interests, because they're the ones with the strongest incentive to pay attention. And so you want to reach your constituents, you want to reach that broader audience, but most Americans are not that tuned into public affairs, and we don't want to ask too much of that broad public. And we can, as we try to reach out and make the system more representative and more accountable, we wind up making it less representative and accountable to organized groups as opposed to that broad public. So those are the concerns that I bring to it, and I think it's very easy to go back and look at some of those earlier reforms. I know there's no going back, because the idea of closing Congress off from the people would never be acceptable. Congress is the people's house. But Congress needs to protect its ability to do the work of the institution.
You're right, and our goal is to make this institution better, so we can better serve the American people, and that means we're going to make some bold and big recommendations over time. So your input is welcome. One last question and point, I guess, is as to Mr. Reeves and Ms. Brooks' outlines of maybe a concern or frustration of mine. Most don't know. I was elected in a special election. And so I came in 6 months prior to Mr. Woodall and others, and during that time I saw this problem with not being able to, the comparative language. I came out of a General Assembly where it was very simple to see what was happening, what was being added, what was being taken away, and the context in which that occurred. My very first amendment was offered in our conference, and it was to be to the House rules. We took the majority coming in next. It was me and Paul Ryan co-sponsored an amendment to make this a process in which we could see the comparative language. And it was opposed by then John Boehner, Speaker going in, incoming Speaker of the House, because it had been indicated to him that it was not possible. It was too big of a task, that this couldn't happen, that he had been informed by the clerk's office and such that this institutionally just could not happen and it's not possible. That was nearly, 8.5 years ago. And here we are today. My question is, how do we avoid that in the future? And this is not, I'm not being critical in any way, but where do new ideas and innovative ideas, how do they get to you or others, and how do they get implemented? Does it require legislation? Does it require a member of Congress having to lobby their entire conference and get a vote to change the House rules to do something, or is it legislation? Or how does that happen, and where do these ideas come from, and how do they get implemented? In less than a decade.
Well, many of the members I've talked to, Mr. Posey included, said that in his state, Florida, that the legislation is the way they draft is pretty much standardized, so that it makes it easier to do these types of comparisons going forward. Here at the House.
And I'm not necessarily speaking about this one concept. I understand it's challenging, but just innovative ideas to help us do our job better. How do they get instituted when we have them?
Well,
and there's no shortage of them either, I know, and that's a challenge.
In most cases, it is a top-down type of suggestion. It's something that is either legislated or put in the rules, and then it's executed. Sometimes the group that carries out that function is consulted on, we're thinking of doing this. What do you think we should include? We have been included in some of those discussions. Other times it's not. Sometimes, we found out about a rule when the rule gets passed, and then we have to react to it. So I think maybe, again, communication is a strong word, but, being able to communicate more like that. Right. Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think?
So the autonomy doesn't, I guess, sit within the clerk's office. There's not a chief person that is looking for new technology to implement. It has to come from top down.
Well, no, not to say that necessarily. So within our area of responsibility, like the legislative process, yes, we look for ways that we can implement a new technology to better do our job. So for instance, one of the things that I put in the testimony is one of our big projects is redoing the legislative information management system. It's a system that's 30 years old that we got from the CAO a long time ago, that we've tried to patch and patch and patch as years have gone on. But this is a system that all of what happens on the floor gets put into there, and then it goes someplace. So we have implemented a project on our own to redo the system. But it's not an easy thing. It's a multi-year project. It's going to be done in phases. So some of the things we do say, hey, we need to do this to do our job better. But then there are other things that may be more from a member perspective that you want to see done.
I see. Mr. Chairman, that's a good delineation. We've seen is they have the autonomy to do things that help them do their job better. But the ideas that we have to help us do our job better have to come from us. That's very helpful to know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver?
I just want to get your opinion. There's a small group of us been working now for several weeks trying to get a bipartisan retreat. I called and had a long conversation with a friend of mine who I begged not to retire when he did, which is weird because he's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and people probably thought I was crazy because I said some things publicly. His name is Ray LaHood, and he did the first retreat that we had back in the 90s, and I think that there was about, maybe it wasn't bad. They had about 90-something participants. It would have been better if we had the majority. There was one problem, though, as some of you may remember. The media was not happy because members didn't want, they didn't want the media sitting in the middle of the retreat as people are trying to figure out how we can work together. So that's one issue. Another is, do you think it's worthwhile? Do you think it even matters?
I mean, certainly we hear from members, especially exit interviews and other oral histories when members talk about their experiences, that knowing other members across the aisle is very important to being legislatively successful. That those relationships make a big difference. We hear that. So how do those get formed, especially in a Congress where members are only here a few days a week, constantly traveling? Each lunch while they're here is monopolized with meetings only with members of their own party. How are you going to forge those relationships across the aisle? So I believe that it matters. I can't present to you as a political scientist data that shows how it matters, but there's certainly a great deal of testimony to that effect, and I wouldn't discount that what members say from their own experiences about how knowing others and building trust is critical to being able to be a successful lawmaker.
Excuse me. Sorry. I'll add that I agree also that of course it matters that members have the ability to have a private space to deliberate, and I think I just want to be clear. I don't think that's at odds with also providing access to the public to see the text of amendments that have already been voted on, for instance, right? So there's a lot of public access questions that are really very far from the question of deliberation, I do transparency, but in no way do I oppose deliberations. And I don't think that any of our recommendations or even any existing House rules really get in the way of creating a deliberative space, except perhaps money, as Daniel mentioned before.
Thank you. Although, this is going to be a weird suggestion.
I'm all ears.
The maitre d' at the Monocle has been there since the 80s. I told you it was going to be weird. I've spent a lot of time with him talking about the difference between now and when he got started as a young guy, and how members would come down, and even if votes were called, Democrats didn't have to worry if they didn't know about the vote, because this is long before we had all of this technology. Because a Republican would come up and say, "Hey, it's time to go to vote," and I don't drink, but sometimes if members were a little tipsy, nobody would leave him. It was a him then, behind. I mean, nobody tried to hurt anybody. They all tried to help. I'm not, maybe he wouldn't be a good witness I don't know, but it wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt to have a non-transparency meeting with him to just hear about the old days. Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of those benefits that Mr. Cleaver talked about, I think, come from the, I think it was Mr. Schumann who talked about the permanent Democratic majority of the 20th century. And I think the permanent Republican majority of the 21st century can bring a lot of that collegiality back when we get to that place. But in the interim, I think it was also Mr. Schumann who said we've got to be able to measure it. I think we've got to be able to set our goal. Dr. Tauber said it was to educate the public better, not transparency for transparency's sake, but transparency for an education sake. I think Dr. Lee put it in deliberative terms and productivity terms, but everyone expressed a concern about the amendment process in particular, whether we're able to have those conversations in private, whether we're able to get access to that information as committee members. We haven't had an open rule certainly not in this Congress, not since Paul Ryan was Speaker. He didn't have any open rules. But in the days of open rules, you could have written an amendment in the nature of a substitute on the back of a cocktail napkin, debated it right there on the House floor, and that would have not just been considered appropriate, but regular order in the best sense of the word. In fact, I see Don Wolfensberger sitting on the back row. He would know better than I, but I'm told that back in the day it was considered a violation of House rules to read a speech on the House floor because it was so offensive that you would have scripted your presentation instead of actually been involved in serious deliberative thought with one another. We've talked a lot about getting back to regular order. Regular order by definition means striking the last word and having amendments on the fly on the House floor. As transparency and productivity advocates, you would tell me what? You prefer where we are with pre-printing requirements for amendments where everybody gets 24 hours to take a peek at them, or you prefer the regular order process where any member with any good idea at any time is able to have that conversation on the House floor, make that a part of the bill, though the public would be behind in that consideration. Mr. Schumann?
Well, the latter, of course. I mean, the whole point of Congress is to be a deliberative body that takes input from all different parties and that thinks through the process. So, of course, it makes sense to have the process, the technology that supports the deliberation. Now, we could, if the first time the amendment's being discussed is live on the House floor, then everyone's getting it at the same time.
Okay.
That's totally fine. I don't think anyone would have any concerns with that. We would want to look to make sure that if there were technical problems with the drafting, people make mistakes. These things aren't always easy. That will be fixed in some fashion. But otherwise, of course, that'd be fine. At least from my perspective.
All right, Dr. Tauber?
Yeah, I agree with the overall sentiment. I would say that although closed rules have the appearance of creating more regularity and better data, and that may be true, from my perspective, trying to educate the public about what Congress is doing, closed rules actually create irregularity because every rule is different. Every time there's a closed rule, there's a different set of timings and where did this come from and who is in charge of creating these closed rules. So it actually creates less transparency in terms of explaining how Congress is operating. And so I would love to see the end of closed rules.
Dr. Lee?
I think most members of Congress and most leaders in Congress would agree that regular order processes are better and that they would like to see those. But we have to ask ourselves, why are they so infrequently used? And why, when a new majority comes to power, do they quickly lose their resolve to stick to regular order? So we have to ask, you have to be realistic about the pressures that you're under as members, or especially as a majority party, to deliver, to get things done. And so under those circumstances, leaders want to regulate participation for members. So I think, I'm struck by the earlier comments I learned about Leader Boehner saying that he didn't think it would be possible to do comparative legislative language. Well, leaders probably are a little skeptical of things that make it really a lot easier for rank and file members to weigh in, because legislative process is so difficult. It's so hard to do anything And so your ability to regulate when other members encounter legislative information, when it becomes available to them, is also a way to help Congress move, help Congress act. And so I think just a recognition of the pressures that leaders have to deal with, and some understanding of why regular order is often untenable in today's era of messaging politics.
The pressures on those leaders do often lead to bad outcomes, which is why we are so fortunate to be on a committee here with two leaders who have been doing nothing but trying to advance the cause of us as a committee and individual members on the committee. And I just want to tell you how much we appreciate that and how much I appreciate you calling this particular hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Are there any other members that have any questions? If not, I want to say thank you. I think this was actually a really good conversation. And frankly, I look at part of the charge of our committee as actually trying to make sure that there's more clarity, more transparency for the American people so that this place functions better on their behalf. I think the conversation around deliberation is an important one, though, right? How do the discussions and the deliberations happen within the people's house so that we can actually legislate in a thoughtful way? I think each of your testimony gave rise to some good suggestions in that regard, and I'm certainly very grateful for it. So thank you for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I would ask each of the witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I also want to express gratitude to we're squatting in the House Administration Committee's committee room, and I want to express my gratitude to them and to their staff for letting us do this, and for all of the staff who have helped us make it through today and are recording the activities. Thank you for that. That's actually also really important to adding transparency to this process, too. So thank you for that. And with that, we're adjourned.